I administered a questionnaire to a number of students who for the first time had been mobilized to volunteer as election observers with Alianza Civica in the midterm elections. And those were interesting midterm elections because they followed that whole 45-day protest and big dispute over the presidential outcome in 2006. And of those first-time volunteer election observers, 93% reported that they would be more likely to be involved in civic associations in the future after having had their experience. A couple of the quotes I wanted to share with you. A young woman from Puebla said, this experience enriches one as a person within the family and to have a better country. A guy from Oaxaca said, well, it helped us to see reality from the perspective of others. So these, to me, very clearly tie into some of our theories and ideas about how social capital is built. It was particularly interesting considering that I asked them a whole battery of questions about what they felt about elections, election administration, political parties, and they all had a much worse opinion of all of the above after the experience of monitoring, yet they came out more committed to the civic role, more committed to their connection to other citizens. I think that we do have some fairly persuasive evidence that despite this decreasing macro trend of how Alianza Civica has mobilized observers, that it continues to play an important role in generating both human and social capital for better elections in the country. And the last hypothesis has to do with generating, or modeling nonpartisan support for the democratic process. And I turn again just to a little bit of data from this 2009 questionnaire. Of those first-time volunteer observers, 83% reported that they were as likely or more likely to vote in subsequent elections after their experience. 71% reported that they were more likely to encourage their friends and family to vote. And that to me is indicative of participation in organizations like this, increasing people's support for the democratic process, even if they continue to be disillusioned about the quality of some of their democratic institutions. However, this is a real sort of shorthand note here, and I'd like to explain it to you. I still was thinking about that graph I showed you where you see the mobilization declining over time and how to explain it. And I think the strongest explanation for that is that in an effort to address that 1994 problem, we saw this election was flawed and we had to report that the results were basically adequate. Groups like Alianza Civica and Alianza Civica specifically have been working hard to try to make their tools for gathering information about elections and understanding fraud, broader and sharper and more able to portray, the reality of how elections are being carried out. This type of commitment to ever technical methodologies bolsters an organization's nonpartisan reputation, which is key to its ability to function as a domestic election monitor. If you're using techniques that are grounded in statistical reasoning, you can't, as a domestic observer, be trying to sort of twist the story in favor of a particular candidate that might be close to your heart, since you are, after all, in your home state. And what it has led to is a trend where Alianza Civica, over the years, increasingly emphasizes methodology over mobilization. Because the more technical you make your observing processes, and in the 2009 experience, these were volunteer observers who went out in the 2 weeks before the elections and administered social science surveys to households about their experiences of vote buying in the period prior to the election. Then they went out on election day and watched people vote. But prior to that, they needed a lot of training to go and administer those surveys. Now, many of you have probably been surveyed recently, given the fact that we're in an election period. Some of you may have actually done some of this work yourself. But it requires observers to go up to the door of a house. You select a house, and then you've got to count a certain number of houses down, so you get a random sample from the neighborhood. If the person answered the door was a certain age and you've got too many of that certain age, you thank them and you move on, or you ask if their daughter is home. You try to get a gender balance. You have to do a visual assessment of their socioeconomic status. It's not easy, and it's long, and it's politically sensitive, and it's hard. So not everybody can do that, whereas almost everybody can go to an election site on election day and do a checklist of whether all the ballots arrived on time, whether the booth was set up correctly, whether the polling station is using the voting screen, and they can ask for that piece of paper and get the vote count for the parallel vote tabulation. And as long as they don't call the numbers in wrong, most people who have a basic level of literacy can do that. But most people cannot do the advanced monitoring techniques that the organization is using now. So given all of that, I'll just summarize my conclusions so we can have a little bit more of a discussion. This chapter, looking at the Mexican case, leads me to conclude that there is responsiveness between the presence of serious domestic monitoring organizations and more accountable elections. They're good at reducing blatant election day fraud. If they are not the sole cause themselves, they contribute to a climate in which it's no longer normatively considered acceptable. They're good at generating both social and human capital. People who participate in election observation become committed to their democratic political process. But what's not clearly demonstrated is that they have all that much impact on the broad acceptance of the results or acceptance of the results by political parties, which in many ways is key. Nor are they necessarily doing that much to model nonpartisan support for the process. I'm a little unclear on that one. And the implications of these findings, when you put them together, is something that I've already been discussing. In an effort to expand their success, the things they're good at, in deterring election day fraud, to address more strategic forms of manipulation that have emerged as election day fraud has become, less morally acceptable. Alianza Civica has used increasingly technical observation methods. These, unfortunately, require a smaller and more selective core of volunteers, which reduces the second demonstrated impact that these groups can have on human and social capital, the impact that derives from civic mobilization. And this is a paradox for domestic monitoring organizations. And it, in part, explains the sort of questions that people have raised about the longevity of the model of domestic election observation. But I also think, coming back to the second broad theoretical question that I raised at the beginning about the value of elections for democracy, that the work together highlights the value of the Electoral Act in the process of democracy. So some people say elections are a good sort of definitional threshold for thinking about democracy because it's a clear way of defining democracy. Some people say elections are important because they reduce the likelihood of violence, and that in turn is key to our understanding of democracy. But I would say that we should also highlight the value of the act itself, the counting and the casting of ballots and the civic interaction that happens around election day itself. This because being present, living that long day of watching people in line at the polls, seeing your neighbors come to vote and cast your vote, watching your neighbors count each other's votes, taking the time out of your own day as an observer to go and participate in that election process, all of this is part and parcel of what that civic social capital gain is about. So I think this is just one work among others that highlights that value, but I do want to bring that forward. Now, when I talk about election monitoring, people always ask me, so, you spend a lot of time in Mexico, Peru, Venezuela, Nicaragua. That's great, but what about home? What about here? Don't we need election monitors? Well, just proving that the United States, having claimed its status as a democracy, is able to twist things up. This morning, I turned on the radio and heard a story on NPR on efforts to prevent voter fraud and how they are drawing scrutiny. Anybody hear that story?
No.
Anybody else hear that story? Well, this is a story about the explosive emergence of domestic election monitoring in the United States for this election. Except in our case, what we have are civic groups